Because this brings with it additional violence, it brings with it exploitation, it brings with it lots of unknowns, a drugs market that you can't control, drugs coming in that you can't necessarily control, the quality of them or know exactly who's behind them. It makes policing a lot harder. A guy who moved up to Ipswich to run a county line there formed a relationship with a gang, and what he didn't realize perhaps he was signing up to was a kind of rivalry that would eventually put him in prison for 15 years. The most common substance that they found in these shrimps was not pesticides. Cocaine.
Oh my God.
There's this whole crazy industry that is worth £500 million. And essentially what County Lines is an extension of that brutality from London to the suburbs, the villages, the smaller towns and cities. It was the first case in which they said, actually, we need to think about this and look at how the kids are being treated and say, okay, they're not actually the perpetrators here, they are the victims. You know, they want to look cool and their reputation has taken a hit and now they need to do something about that. That's the level that can lead to a murder. The dogs who bark the loudest are the scaredest, aren't they? And you know, anyone who's hyper vigilant like that, who's really, really hyped up, he doesn't know who's going to come through the door next. You just, you know, there's a story behind everybody's. I know you can tell I'm not from the street, right?
The world is racing to get back to normal. We all want to meet up again. But after a year of being locked down, it takes time to get back to normal. When we are going through things, we tend to turn to our friends to talk to, but they don't necessarily give us the best advice. We all need help from time to time, and asking for support is a sign of strength. It is not weak. Help is available immediately through Talkspace, who will match your needs with a licensed professional. You could get the help right away. Start feeling better with a single message. Match with a licensed therapist when you go to Talkspace.com, and you will get $100 off your first month if you use the promo code Shaun, SHAUN. That's $100 off when you use the promo code Shaun at Talkspace.com. This is one of James's all-time favourite books. James and Joe, our cameraman and sound engineer. We have got the author, Jason Farrell, in here today. And I'll just have a look at the back. In the past few years, the UK has seen an unparalleled rise in knife crime, youth violence and school exclusions. Vulnerable adults and children as young as 8 are being tooled up, trained as drug mules, and sent to all corners of the country to assist in county lines drug dealing. Our mission statement on this channel is end the war on drugs and take all of those resources and use it to go after predators. Because the war on drugs has created this. If you've watched our interviews with our Leap cops, Simon McLean out of Scotland, Neil Woods, and more recently, Suzanne, then you will see from the perspective of the police even, they know all this is wrong, everything's upside down. The system needs some dramatic changes because the drug traffickers, it's an arms race, Neil Woods said, where they have to innovate, and County Lines is part of the innovation to combat what the police come up with. It just goes on and on and on and on until it gets more and more out of control. Anyway, thanks for coming on, Jason.
That's okay.
Yeah. So prior to the filming then, you said there was something in Suffolk called the Scoreboard. We're going to get into that in a second. But what made you write this book?
I've been, as a journalist, looking at county lines for quite a while. I'd done a small documentary on it where I'd gone in and to crack houses and met some of the people who were running the lines, met some of the mules, And then the publisher basically approached me. But the thing that interested me and the way that I start the book is all these interwoven lives, and the way that it might be a dinner lady living in Yorkshire whose son suddenly goes missing, or a young girl who's living in a care home who gets kind of invited to go and deliver a package to Southampton, or it might be some guy who's an Iraqi Kurd who's a refugee who gets hooked on drugs and then becomes a kind of enforcer for the drugs. There's this whole crazy industry that is worth £500 million in this country. And okay, yep. I feel like I'm eating it now. I don't have to eat it now.
No, push it down a little bit so it's not in front of your face.
Okay,
there we go.
There's this whole crazy industry, and all these credible characters caught up in it. And what really struck me was I was doing a report one day. I start the book with it, where I was trying to look at how much cocaine was being consumed in the country. And I went to meet this guy who tested water samples. And we were talking about the amount, we could work out how much cocaine was being consumed in London by the amount that was basically being pissed down the toilet.
That's interesting.
Yeah, so you can work out from the byproduct and then take samples from the Thames and figure it all out.
Wow.
But one of the other things he was doing as well was he was asked to look at pesticides in the countryside. And what they do is they're trying to find out whether farmers are using illegal pesticides. So they go to these tiny little tributaries and streams around Suffolk, get the shrimps and see whether in the shrimps there are any pesticides. And when they put all these shrimps into this, what's called I can't even remember, a spectrometer machine that they use.
Shrimpometer.
The shrimpometer machine to test what all the substances are in the shrimp. The most common substance that they found in these shrimps was not pesticides. Cocaine.
Oh my God.
The second most common substance was the cutting agents that are used for cocaine.
Wow.
So this wasn't just the main river running through Ipswich. This was the little tributaries in the small kind of rural backwaters of the Gipping River in Suffolk. And it just so happened that when I was doing that, talking to him, he mentioned this place, and I thought, I've just been to a murder in Suffolk, or I'd just been writing about this murder in Suffolk, which was all connected to county lines, drug trading, and just the idea of this connection between these shrimps stuffed with cocaine in the backwaters of Suffolk and this horrific murder of this young lad. That there's a connection there. And that's the thing that really fascinated me, the way that all these lives somehow getting sucked into this business that is, let's face it, getting out of hand.
So I've got to ask this. You hear about the rats in Rat Park getting high off the heroin water. Were the shrimp getting high off the coke in this Suffolk water?
We don't know what their mental state was. I mean, obviously, when they're in the laboratory, they've been dried, so they're not high at all. They've been dried out. But as they're these shrimp feed on a diet of whatever's sitting in the silt of the river.
Yeah.
And the concern was, what's this going to do to the ecosystem if all these pesticides get into all these small animals? And funnily enough, they did another study, which I think they did not just shrimp, but other, worms and other things, and found the same thing. So yes, the pesticides are bad for the shrimp, but I imagine the cocaine isn't doing them any favors either.
What about the wee then in the London area?
Well,
what was the analysis?
I tell you what's interesting about that. So what they've done is they've done these tests in countries and capital cities around the world, and London is way above any other capital city in terms of the amount of cocaine that is in the system. I can't off the top of my head tell you how much it is, but it's this, it's a significant. And we what we did was we went to a flour mill to kind of give ourselves the rough idea of what it would look like a day's amount of cocaine, and I can kind of show you. It's a big cone of about, if I were to stretch my hands to either side, it's like that. If you were to pour flour into that, And of course, that's not including all the cutting agents and everything else. That's pure cocaine. So that's London's daily use.
Good grief.
And
Daily
then,
use.
yeah, extraordinary. And what's really interesting is that London, over sort of the last sort of 5 years, has sort of plateaued. It hasn't gone up. No one's particularly caught up with them. But what they have done is that, for example, they do a test in Bristol. And Bristol's cocaine use has gone up fourfold, I think it was. The amount that they were finding in the rivers in a roughly sort of 4 or 5 years. So there's been a massive increase in Bristol. And obviously we don't do these tests these tests aren't done everywhere. And I did try and see if we could get them to do the tests in other cities, but you have to get everyone on board. You have to get the water companies on board, you have to get the council on board and so on and so forth. So they weren't able to do that. But imagine if they did do the tests in Ipswich and in, Bury St Edmunds and any of these towns. And what it shows is that the drug markets are probably moving out. London plateaued. And that's been the experience of the gangs and the kids in London who are selling these drugs. And we've seen this increase in knife crime on the streets in London, where there's lots of crossover and people are getting stabbed and it's getting more and more brutal. And essentially what County Lines is an extension of that brutality from London to the suburbs, the villages, the smaller towns and cities. So that's actually that strange water test actually shows us what's going on in the country.
Yeah. I love a book that has like the interweaving stories of people who are affected by the same thing. Like Chasing the Screams, one of my favorite books. So these characters then, you said like the co-home girl, the dinner lady, are their stories featured in the book?
Yeah, so each chapter is a different story, and each story tries to represent a different aspect of the industry. So the first chapter is called The Mummy Mule, and this is a woman I met through a contact who was transporting drugs on a line from London to Southend. And she's getting into it because her son is involved in the gang, and her son has persuaded her that he's at risk if he does it. So the best thing that she can do is kind of do it for him, and that will help him out. I just described it as a bit like a student coming home and getting mum to do the washing. It's coercing motherly love to try and get you to take a bit of the grief that he would get for having to go and do this. And she's terrified. She's absolutely terrified. She goes with bundles of drugs, taped up, and she drops them off to the trap houses and gets out of there as quickly as she can. And she doesn't, I said to her, how do you feel being a drug dealer? And she said, I'm not a drug dealer. And it's like, well, you are kind of part of the system. And she goes, no, it's terrible. And but brilliant camouflage. The police would be unlikely to stop this fairly respectable looking mother. Doesn't look like your average drug dealer. And I think that's the way that these kids have sort of become quite useful to the gangs, is that you wouldn't think that a 12-year-old is carrying a big bundle of drugs, and so they're quite useful as mules. And the other drug mule I met was a young girl. She was 16 at the time I met her, but she was 13 when she got sucked into County Lines, and she was living in a care home. And just give me a dry mouth there.
Yeah. She
was living in a care home, and she was just asked by, I'll put that down there. Sorry. She was asked, to start doing deliveries. And on one of her first deliveries, the drugs get stolen off her. And of course, it's the classic tactic. She loses the drugs. She has to go back to the boss and say, I'm really sorry. And he stabs her. He says she was stabbed in the bottom, which apparently is quite common. I understand, because it's seen as not going to be fatal if you stab someone in the bottom, but you can cause a decent enough injury that someone's not going to be able to sit down for a few days. And so that's quite a common thing to do. She was stabbed in the bottom, and and then she's debt bonded. Now, you're going to have to work for us until you get the money back. So that is quite a common way of getting people involved. So she's then sucked into it, and she suffers all sorts of things, including being a young girl, sexual abuse. And so her story is quite a tragic one, actually. And after I interviewed her, I know that she still struggled, and for a while she ended up in a mental institution. So the mental impact of the kind of stuff that's going on is something we shouldn't overlook. That's happening to these young kids, because this is not normal what these kids are going through. And actually, if you think of the old gang structure as it used to be on the estates or something like that, the one thing that might be said for it is that these kids felt like they were protected. That they were in a gang. You join a gang, and it might not be ideal, but you feel like at least you've got some family, someone who sort of, perhaps it's a misguided decision to join that kind of a family, but at least they are potentially going to look after you. And one of the first people I interview in the book is a drug dealer who's just works on the Broadwater estate, and he comes from that old school style of drug dealing. And his point was, that's gone. There's no love anymore, is the way he put it. Everyone's almost for themselves. And this is an industry now. It's about, the gang business is really, it's not about bringing people in. It's about sending them out. It's about, you're much more alienated, and these kids being sent to towns, miles away from their own homes, from their own friendship circles and all that sort of thing. Actually, they're incredibly exposed. So the advantages of the gang network, were there any in the first place? But if there were some, those don't exist anymore. And this is a much, much harsher environment that these kids are now living in.
So we've got a lot of people watching in America then. We probably don't even know what county lines means. How would you define it?
Actually, really, it's about the phone. It's about a phone network. And all it is it's a branded phone. It's a phone number that, and perhaps the best way to explain it is to go into some of could go into some of the examples in a minute. But basically what it is guy has a supply of drugs. He goes out to an area that he hasn't been to before, picks a town, taps into the local drug market, maybe by getting some users to recommend some friends. The phone number gets shared around, and then he sets up a satellite dealership in that area. And then runs it's almost like the Amazonization of the drug industry. So now you can ring up, rather than having to go down and find your dealer on the street. You ring up, you call a takeout. And the great advantage, obviously, for the guy in London or in Manchester or in one of the big cities is that their footprint isn't really there. Once they've been up there, they've set up their business, they've got kids doing the dropping off for them. They might have coerced the local drug dealer to work for them. So it comes with a level of at least threat and intimidation, because you have to take over the local market. And what a lot of people in the police say is, because this brings with it additional violence, it brings with it exploitation, it brings with it lots of unknowns, a drugs market that you can't control, drugs coming in that you can't necessarily control, the quality of them, or know exactly who's behind them. It makes policing a lot harder. So actually, rule number one for the police is to try and get things back to how it used to be, to try and beat this system of using these networks of phones. But it has. So what it's done is, over the last 3 or 4 years, it went from there were about 300 lines. Then there was, the following year, there was like 750 lines. Then in 2018, I think it was, it back end of it jumped up to around 2,000 of these lines. So it was massively growing. At its peak, it was around 4,000. Over lockdown, there has been quite a lot of police activity, and they have managed to crack down. So there's probably around about, I think there's around 600 lines at the moment. Still a lot, but they have had quite a big crackdown on it.
So what's the legal advantage of using a kid?
legal advantage is that you can say to the kid, you're not going to get as many years because you're a junior, you're a minor. So in fact, you're not even potentially committing a crime. I mean, this is the legal area is very, very interesting on this. For the drug dealer, at least, they can say, look, you're very unlikely to get a very big sentence for this. Legally, you're not as much risk as I am, the older bloke. Secondly, obviously, if you're using kids, you're less likely. I mean, one drug dealer said to me, I'd never use kids because they'd dob me in. But actually, from experience and what I've seen from police investigations, the kids stay very quiet. They don't seem to speak out against who their handlers are. And even in one case where there were like 10 kids, they couldn't get a single one of them to speak out and say the name, the handler. Even after the handler was arrested, they couldn't get one of them to speak up in court.
They're scared.
They're terrified. And so there's another advantage. No one's going to dob you in. It seems like if you can run a level of fear over these kids, and, somehow these kids seem to think that this is going to be a great life for them. And they can get, if they've not got much at home, they can get, nice trainers, they can get nice stuff, all the gear, and, earn money quickly over the summer holidays or whatever. But actually, from looking at when kids have been rescued from trap houses or whatever, they're not living the life. They don't have cool trainers and stuff like that. They're usually in the clothes they left their home in. And a lot of the time they are literally wearing the clothes they left home in, and living in absolute squalor. So there's nothing in it for the kids. I mean, they really, they really should know that. It's not the El Dorado that they think it's going to be, but that's what they're sold. That's for sure.
It's a form of modern day slavery then.
It is. And so the really interesting, when this was realized that this was modern day slavery, was this case called the Castro line, which was in Lincoln. And what happened was there were these two addicts, and they bought some drugs off these two kids in town. These two kids were like skinny runts. I mean, they looked so young. They thought, well, let's just rob them, get our money back. So they go to rob these kids, and the kids pull out knives that and really badly stab these two addicts. So then they're in hospital and they're practically on life support, these guys, and the police interview them and say what happened. And they don't want to say, they don't admit to who's, but the police get wind that there's these two kids in town. So eventually they, through sources, discover that these kids are staying in this local house, and they raid the house. They find a bloodied knife. They find wraps and drugs and stuff like that. And they interview the kids, and the kids don't say what's going on, but it turns out they've both gone missing from Birmingham. So the kids go back home, and at this point, the police officer involved has seen the conditions in which these kids are living and thinks, I don't see these guys as criminals. I see them as having been exploited by someone. The parents have said they've gone missing. They've actually come from homes that have reported them missing. They didn't, the parents didn't want their kids to go. And so something weird's going on here. So what they decide to do is they put a surveillance on the house. And then this guy turns up in a car, and he's obviously got the key to the house, and they decide to follow him. And sure enough, a couple of weeks later, he's got two more kids in the back of the car. And so they keep an eye on what's going on, and they decide, even though they can see these kids are now selling drugs, to go on a surveillance operation, see what else they can find out about this guy. And turns out he hasn't got insurance on his car. So they stop the car, and they say they're stopping him for insurance, impound the car, but actually they don't send it to the impound, they send it to forensics. The forensics team find a Ribena bottle in the back, which has got DNA of the kids who they just rescued. So they've got that. Then they find the phone, which all the local drug users are on it who are referring to this phone as the Castro line. The only thing that's not in it, it doesn't have the SIM card in it, but they can use the body of the phone to find out. So they know this guy is running what's called the Castro line. And they then rescue these other two kids that he's just brought up to town. And again, there are knives in the apartment. They're living in absolute squalor. And again, the police officer thinks these guys are being trafficked. But now the guy hasn't got his car anymore. And so they just keep watching him, see what he's doing. He's using taxis to deliver the drugs. He's using the rail network. And then they keep an eye on the missing persons program in Birmingham. And sure enough, a couple more people go missing. And then CCTV picks him up with them getting on the train to Lincoln. So now they've got nearly everything they need. They raid the address, they rescue the kids, and they arrest him. And for the first time in history, the Modern Slavery Act has in it, of 2015, Section 45, it has something about coercion. So if you're coerced into doing something, you can use it as a mitigating circumstance for why you committed a crime. And they said, well, how about we change that? So it's not mitigating circumstances. We actually say it's not just that it's mitigating for the kids, but actually we can use that to say this guy was committing an act of modern slavery. And so rather than go after the kids, they slump another charge on this guy of modern slavery. And he actually eventually admits to it. And so he gets an extra 7 years on top of the 5 years he got for the smuggling of the drugs. So that it was the first case in which they said, actually, we need to think about this and look at how the kids are being treated and say, okay, they're not actually the perpetrators here, they are the victims. And that changed the face of it. After that, there's been a whole load of police operations where they've rescued hundreds of children over the course of a week of operations from addresses. And in each case, they said, we're going to treat these guys as victims. Now, the only downside to that,
it's the legal advantage again, isn't it?
It's the legal advantage. So the guys can say, well, you're not going to get arrested.
You're a victim now. You're a victim of modern day slavery.
Yeah, so
you get out of jail free.
You've got to get out of jail free. And with the Castro line, one of the kids they rescued in the third property they raided was the same as one of the kids they rescued in the second property. So your whole legal question is an absolutely fascinating one. Because at what point as well, if that kid then coerces his brother into doing it, or his mate at school, does that kid then become no longer a victim, but part of the problem? And that then brings you into the whole other world of, when do you get to these kids? How do you stop these kids getting involved in the first place? Because that's the fundamental question here as to why these kids think that it's worth their while to go and sell drugs in a town they've never been to before with strangers and living with drug addicts. What's the appeal, and what's going on in their minds just to think that's a good idea? So, but it's a very, very interesting area of law, and it's changed very recently.
And for people watching this, if you didn't see our podcast with Andrew Wallace, who helped to bring in the Modern Day Slavery Act, so that's in the True Crime Podcast playlist if you want to follow up and see what Andrew went through to get that introduced. And it's interesting to see how it's been exploited by the traffickers, because it just, again, it's part of the arms race. And I believe personally that the solution is to legalize and decriminalize drugs, starting with weed, because weed is the most consumed drug in the world. Weed is what's being dealt the most in this country. And it's absolutely ridiculous that all these countries around the world are legalizing and decriminalizing, yet we're not. Yet the politicians who are maintaining this have probably done it themselves. It's just an absolute bullshit, double standard, hypocrisy. How do you feel about that?
About legalization?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, your point about everyone taking it was certainly and when you talk about cocaine, what we were talking about at the beginning, the river tests in London just show you the amount of it washing around. And I think you mentioned some police officers you've spoken to. I think I know
Neil Woods.
I've spoken to him on the phone, and the point that he makes, or he made to me, was we can arrest a drugs gang and can spend months taking them out, and within a few hours or even a day or so, someone will jump into their place because the market's there. And I think certainly from what I've seen from, say, for example, drug spaces in Glasgow where there's a big heroin problem, things like consumption rooms where you say, let's do this in a safe place. Let's accept that these people have an addiction and we need to help them through it. I can see strong arguments for that.
Like in Portugal.
Yeah, exactly. Portugal have done it very effectively, and it's brought down. I mean, Glasgow currently has the highest death rate for taking drugs in Europe. I think probably in the world.
Wow.
Yeah. It's a staggering, and it's gone up, and it's a staggering number of people who die from taking drugs in Glasgow, and they need to get on top of it, and they know they need to get on top of it, and they're trying to lobby the Westminster government to have more consumption rooms for heroin. I mean, the other argument I can see supporting your case around marijuana is, that is quite a big chunk of the illegal market trade. So if you were to take that out, you suddenly make their business less profitable. And I think, one of the things that has probably fueled the growth of county lines isn't just mobile technology, although that is massive. But it's probably also just the fact that, so certainly in the cocaine market, it's got, the drugs got cheaper, more people can afford to take it. So it's no longer kind of like the choice of bankers and the middle class dinner parties. It's an everyman drug now. And if those everyman drugs are out, then something like weed is part of the illegal black market, then it's just a bigger market for them, isn't it? So I can understand it. I'm not sure I have a kind of strong view, because I still think that weed, certain types of weed, talking to GPs I know, certainly the stronger brands of skunk can lead to psychosis and all sorts of problems. So legalizing something that can cause psychosis and serious mental health problems, I concern about. I think also, having seen some of the people recovering on various drug addiction groups and stuff like that, and what they have to go through, again, is it the right message to send out to them that that drug is legal? I don't know. I'm not a policymaker. I wouldn't like to have to make that decision, but I can see your argument.
It's minimizing harm, isn't it? Because you can't stop people taking drugs.
No.
And in terms of the really strong strains, I agree. But wouldn't it be better to have the government controlling that, and people knew what they were getting then, rather than it being on the black market and all the criminality around it?
Well, I think that's with weed. You're talking about the kind of the model in Holland, aren't you?
Yeah.
Where you can go into a shop and you can, but it's kind of weird, because that is such a big part of the culture, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, it's almost like it's a tourism thing, that people will go there so that they can go and smoke a reefer in a cafe or something like that.
But the young people of Holland have very low weed usage, don't they? It's all the adults are doing it, and it's not cool to do what the adults are doing, is it?
Well, no, this is it, isn't it? So the real way to get rid of a problem is for one generation to do it, and then the other generation will kind of go, "You guys are so uncool." I think that's happening with alcohol, and my kids look at us and go, "What are you doing, drinking all that wine?"
Yeah, don't blame them. All right, so what about then the enforcement side of this? You said earlier about foot soldiers and someone from Iraq, was it?
Oh, well, I was talking about, the guy I met from Iraq was a hitman, and he was
from Iraq.
Yeah, and he'd got
what was his story then?
Where we called him handsome because he would have been rather dashing looking chap, actually. Except that his face was completely ravaged by years of taking pretty much everything he'd ever taken. And yeah, he was an enforcer for drug debts and things like that. And he's told some pretty horrifying stories.
So he was born in Iraq then?
Born in Iraq, came over on a boat.
How old?
He would have been about in his 20s when he came over.
And where did he establish himself?
Tottenham area. Yeah. And became just someone said, do you want to try a bit of this, a bit of that? And clearly had an incredibly addictive personality and became addicted to pretty much everything. And because he'd come through what was then the, what do you call it? In Sangat, where the refugees, I've forgotten the name of the place, we call it the refugee camp in the forest on the other side in Calais.
Yeah.
And he'd lived in that refugee camp for a while. And that was kind of one of the trafficking routes for people, but also guns. And so he was a gun smuggler. And he would be able to traffic people. Actually, he talked a lot about trafficking people out of the UK. People who wanted to avoid the authorities. He said he did that quite a lot. But he also was involved in putting people in the backs of lorries. And, you know, if you're doing that, then if you've got a room for a few guns and stuff like that as well. And so as a guy who could then get hold of guns, he was then seen as someone who could be used to intimidate people. And so he would, and, you know, again, use of technology. He'd put trackers on cars and things like that to follow people who he'd be sent a picture on Snapchat of the person he needed to go and beat up or whatever. And that's what he did. And, you know, he was someone who had been through, you know, captured in an ISIS-style camp where he'd been held captive for 6 months. So he'd seen some bad stuff and had been shot in the leg himself before as a punishment. So he'd had some pretty brutal, he'd had a pretty brutal upbringing.
Did he tell you what he saw in the camp?
I think he spent a lot of time in a cell. So he mostly heard stuff. And he heard people being beaten up, and it was just kind of, it was an Islamic fundamentalist group that captured him, and he escaped. So he was
how did he escape?
Iraqi Kurd. He I believe kind of got into the back of a truck and hid in this truck that drove off and got across. Yeah, and he managed to make his way. I'm not entirely sure how he did it. He got his way into Turkey, and from Turkey got on a boat to Italy, and somehow made his way up to Calais, and then got himself in the back of a lorry to get to the UK and ended up in London. I mean, it's a heck of a journey. But he says nothing killed me off more than the drug addiction, you know. And he actually he said, I love this country. It gave me an opportunity, but at the same time, you know, the weird thing was his view was that drug dealers should go to prison for life. You know, he was, you know, and yet he was part of the system. You know, he said the system's too soft. The system's too soft on us. You know, we should, you know, I guess by this stage he had an 8-year-old kid, and, you know, he was thinking of his kid, and he said, I don't want him to grow up in this world. Yeah, so that was him.
What enforcement stories did he tell you?
Well, I mean, he told me, he didn't tell me, he didn't, I'd asked him if he'd shot anybody.
Yeah.
And at one point he'd said he had, but then he sort of said no comment. But he'd definitely beaten people up with baseball bats.
Wow.
Yeah. He was that guy. You don't want him knocking on your door. Yeah.
So did you interview people who were recipients of violence?
I'm just trying to think. No, I don't. Well, I mean, obviously I had the woman the girl who was stabbed. in the bottom. I interviewed the family of kids who'd been killed in gang violence, and got some of their stories. And I have to say that a lot of the time it was pretty trivial stuff that led to the violence. And I think a lot of the time when we look at the kind of violence going around now in London and elsewhere, we associate it with drugs, but often it might be people who are associated with drug dealing, but often the reasons behind the stabbings and the beatings and the murders can be really trivial stuff. And one of the stories I tell in this book is about a guy who moved up to Ipswich to run a county line there, formed a relationship with a gang of guys who were also kind of drill artists, music artists, and they were a rival gang they were called J Block, and there's a rival gang called Nino. And what he didn't realize perhaps he was signing up to was a kind of rivalry that would eventually put him in prison for 15 years because he was involved in a murder where 6 people just basically sprung out on this guy from a rival gang, and there were 6 of them, and who knows who stabbed this guy or who crashed him over the head with a bottle, but they all went down. I think 5 of them went down for murder. Maybe there's one guy driving the van who didn't, but he was an addict. And the story there was basically it was about music. It was partly about music. So it was about the fact that J Block sang about being the big guys in Ipswich and how they were gonna, beat up Nemo. And Nemo sang about how they were gonna beat up J Block. And then one day the town's too small for that. Of course they're gonna cross paths at the local cinema and the local shop. And then one day this gang gets the cool guys from the song get chased into this soap shop. Have you ever heard of Lush?
Yeah.
Okay, well, if you've got like young children, you buy like cloud-shaped bars of soap and bath bombs that you can make your own. So if you're a cool drill artist, the last place you want to get caught hiding out from the other gang members is a little soap shop. And these guys are basically chased into the soap shop and are kind of cowering behind the soap bars when these other lads come in to beat them up. And even worse for them is the whole thing gets broken up by an undercover cop and they all get a ticking off. So these guys who are really renowned in the town as being really cool and the top, guys to not mess with, have had their reputation completely destroyed by this moment in the soap shop. And so they go back and get all their gang together and say, right, we're going to have to get revenge, go into the rival territory, pick off the first guy who's walking down the street, who happens to be this guy called Tavis Spencer, and beat and stab him to death.
Bloody hell.
Yeah, chase him up the street.
Did he have anything to do with anything?
He'd been in one of the other videos.
Oh.
I mean, literally, he was working that day as a car mechanic. He's nothing to do with what happened in the town. And it all comes out in the court case. And the funny thing is that, they all turn on each other, the guys in the dock, because there's little bits of evidence against each of them. So they're like, no, it was him. And they basically just condemn each other. They're all at the scene. They all put each other at the scene. And they all go down for murder. And that's just, it's trivial. And yet it's tied up in the fact that these guys, it's tied up in the fact that these guys associate with a gang, that their gang maybe sell drugs in a certain place, but it's almost not even that. It's just, they want to look cool and their reputation has taken a hit, and now they need to do something about that. That's the level that can lead to a murder.
Wow. If you want to know more about drill rap, watch our podcast with Skengdo and AM in the True Crime Podcast playlist. So who was Uncle?
So Uncle was the first guy I met, in fact, probably really the only guy I've ever met who's running a county line. And I have a very good fixer based in Tottenham who put me in touch with Uncle. And the reason I call him Uncle is because that's how he refers to himself when he's recruiting the kids. You know, Mummy and Daddy can't give you what you want. Come to Uncle.
Wow.
So Uncle really explained to me how the whole system works. So I went to meet him in his trap house. He's got his, he's got his rolled up money and his drugs on the table and his Rambo knife. And he's got the Rambo knife there, and he's even got a client in with him who's giving some crack to. I know you can tell I'm not from the street, right? I'm not here because of my lived experience. I'm here because I've met lots of people and I've researched it from an independent perspective and got to know these people and understand what they're doing. I'm not from the street.
Did you ever think about smoking crack as part of your research?
No, I didn't. I'm happy to watch someone do it. I'm happy to watch the guy. And the stupid thing is, this is the really stupid thing. If you're going in to go and interview someone who's smoking crack, don't wait until they've smoked the crack to interview them. Get the microphone out real quick. So I'm interviewing this guy and I'm saying, how's it feel? And he's like, it's great. And I said, so how do you feel right now? I feel high. Yeah, okay. So tell me about, why you do this. And of course, by that point, I'm kind of losing him. And he was just going off into stratosphere. But it's interesting, the people who were taking the crack they spoke to, I couldn't find anyone to express any regret in the moment that they were doing it. I do this because, but then when you say, well, what do you regret? Well, I suppose I regret the money. I suppose I regret the fact that I basically spend every last penny I have on money. And then it's just for me to look at them and go, well, I regret for you that you look like a ravaged, aged beyond your years person who's never ever going to achieve anything more than the high that you're getting right now from the drug that you're taking, unless you can do something about this, unless you can somehow get off it. But there's no way with Uncle standing here supplying you and taking your whatever small wage you get off you that you're ever going to be able to do that. But Uncle and his friend, when I interviewed them, obviously I don't want to know what they look like. I don't want the cameras to know what they look like because I'm filming them. And, you could get a police injunction and say, hand over your footage. So I make sure that we don't know what they look like. So they're wearing these and they're these sort of bug-eyed masks. They look like Doctor Who characters almost, as they're dealing the drugs. But at one point, I remember feeling quite intimidated because I'm just asking them more and more and more about the business and about, he's telling me how he recruits these kids and he sends them to, I keep putting the bottle on there. I'm so sorry. Yeah, I'm terrible. I'm messing up the joint. And he's talking about, recruiting them. He says he sends them to boot camp. So boot camp is wherever they go it's just like he's running X Factor or something. And in the suburbs or wherever it is, where he introduces them to the various people who they're going to sell to. And then what he says, once I've set them up and given them everything they need, then they're off there on their own sort of thing. And then I was talking about what if there's a rival gang? Well, then we give them knives and they go and sort it out, and it's all this sort of stuff. And I said, do you ever get rivals coming in? And as soon as I started to talk about the threat to his business, he gets really pumped up, he's getting quite agitated. And then he just unsheathes this knife and says, doesn't matter who you are, if you've with me, you're going to get it. And then he's looking at me and I was like, well, the one thing about being a bit of a posh arsehole, is that, you know, people look at you, they don't really feel that threatened by you. You know, I'm not that threatening, really. So so the obvious thing to do when someone's holding a knife and saying, if you mess with me and all of that, is to do an Oprah, which is what I call an Oprah, where you suddenly huge empathy. This must be really tough on you, you know, living like this. And then he sits down, he goes, yeah, you know, things I've seen. And so he goes from, oh, you know, I've certainly messed with me, to, God, yeah, I've seen pregnant women smoking crack, and, you know, and you know, so but all, you know, the dogs who bark the loudest are the scaredest, aren't they? And you know, anyone who's hyper vigilant like that, who's really, really hyped up, he doesn't know who's going to come through the door next. You just, you know, there's a story behind everybody's, the reason why they've become like that. And they do genuinely have, you know, not a sob story, but a reason why they're in that position. And so I'm willing to listen to that, as well as the machismo of we're going to send the kids knives and stab our rivals. Because behind all of that is, of course, deep insecurity.
How does one go about arranging an interview with Uncle?
So it's my fixer.
You have a fixer?
I can't. Well, not a fixer. A friend. I credit them in the books. There's a woman who runs a charity called Raising My Voice Foundation, called Nevers Kamal, and she has a great empathy with the community. Do you remember the story of baby P?
Yeah.
In Haringey, abused child.
Yeah.
She was the social worker who blew the whistle. So I first got to know her through that. And we've kind of remained friends. And if I've needed to kind of get a case study of someone who's living in difficult accommodation, or it's just certain things, or I want to speak to a gang member or something, she usually knows someone, because she will help them with their parole, or she's, you know, they've got some problem with immigration. So she's there for them. They trust her, and she trusts me. That's it. And very tragically, she had a daughter called Azra, who was a young, sassy, beautiful woman who grew up knowing all these kids on the street. And she was my sort of second go-to I certainly met some of the runners that I spoke to through her, a couple of the dealers, the mummy mule who I referred to at the beginning, she knew. And so she was really helpful when I was first really not making the book, making the documentary. But sadly, she died last year. She was in a very bizarre accident in which her car caught fire in the middle of a road coming back from Brighton. And she was with another guy, and she jumped. They got out of the car, and she jumped across the carriageway. And you know, like those carriageways where there's a gap in the middle, but it's late at night, you can't see the gap. And there was just the weird thing is, I've nearly done it myself once at a protest where I jumped across the carriageway to try and get on the other side. And I've seen someone do it as well at the same protest, where you think, and suddenly you fall down the middle. Yeah.
She fell down the middle.
She fell down the middle, yeah. And she died.
Holy shit.
Yeah. Very, very
That's
strange.
Terrible.
Very, well, I mean, it's all very, very strange circumstances. And I don't know the whole thing. And there was a whole inquest into it. But yeah, so she was she was one of my kind of key fixers, if you like, contacts, who just, it was great fun, always knew what was going on the street. And I guess because she was just so no nonsense, you know, she'd just go up to someone and say, who's stealing the drugs around here? We need to speak to some dealers. We'd arrive in Southend and we'd go, right, I'd be going off talking to the homeless people or whatever, and she'd just go straight up to, wait, come on, tell me where are they? Who's dealing the drugs? And I go, okay, well, it's this guy. Okay, well, come over here. So she was a force of nature who we've sadly lost, but she was one of my she was very dear, and she was a great character. And so, that is how, through Azra and Nevruz, I was able to make contact with people involved in this business.
So was Uncle masked up when you went to
I have no idea.
him?
I know he went back into prison.
Oh, he's in prison now, is he?
I think he's in prison now, yeah.
I was going to wonder if he would come on the podcast, but if he's in prison...
Tricky.
Okay.
I'll find out for you if he's out.
All right, so you've met some of the runners as well.
Yeah.
Have we talked about them yet?
Well, I mean, I've talked to you about Lucy, who's the one who's running Southampton, who got stabbed. And I talked to you about the mummy mule who was going to Southampton. There was another very the dinner lady I was telling you about at the beginning. Her son was a runner, and that was an interesting story because, I mean, she's just she had a normal family, lived in a sleepy village near to, in sort of Yorkshire, not particularly near to any major towns, actually. And Harrogate was the nearest town. And her son just started going missing.
Mm.
And these are the kind of telltales. Obviously, that's a pretty shocking sign. But she was saying he just became a little bit more detached to start with. And he'd be going down the skate park and he'd be kind of hanging out there, but she wasn't sure why he was hanging out there. And obviously it turned out that he met some guys who were coercing him, suggesting he would, should go and make a few deliveries and that sort of thing. And he then just started going missing. And so she'd be going out at night looking for him. And then one night, he'd been missing for about 3 or 4 days. And it was like near Christmas. This is a young kid, and why would a kid go missing over Christmas? It's just, and he'd been sleeping under this bridge, and he was absolutely out of his face on drugs. And she found him, and she was in the car, and he basically just tried to push the car. It was absolutely wired up. She describes this, literally kind of jumping out trying to push the bonnet, and eventually she had to kind of get him moved away. So she got him sent to another part of the country in order to kind of get away from this. But of course, if you're in that mentality by then it's quite difficult. But they did manage to, through a pupil referral unit, because obviously he got kicked out of school, but through a pupil referral unit, work with him and turn his life around. And
really?
I think,
wow.
And I think, it's like a lot of these kids, and when I meet them, really what they want is a bit of opportunity. They just, this is just the opportunity that presents itself to them, right? And I said to her, what was the thing, that helped him? She said, well, he was really into fashion. And, the thing that he liked about the drug thing was, well, maybe he could afford to buy himself some good clothes. But when we, showed him that actually he could even maybe work in the fashion industry if he just kind of, did certain things in his studies, he got an apprenticeship with someone, and that's all he needed. He just needed that opportunity. And he's a smart kid. And most of the kids I meet who do this, that's really what they want. I mean, I'll never forget this guy, and I did this documentary on gangs years ago. And this guy in America, in Los Angeles, who was this pastor who was running this project called Homeboy Industries. You ever heard of this?
Mm-mm.
It's really brilliant. It's really brilliant. It's like you go into this factory in the middle of this downtown Los Angeles, and I'd spent about 3 or 4 days with the police going around all the really, really nasty areas and seeing quite nasty stuff. And then, some of the scariest guys I've ever seen were basically working on these printing presses doing T-shirts. and they're working in this factory, and he had set up like a set of factories and coffee shops and just businesses that only employed gang members. And he said, I did it because I just buried he was a pastor. I buried my 1,000th gang member or something like that. This is when Los Angeles was like Vietnam, you know. It was just more people dying there on the streets than in any American war, you know, from just MS-19 and people like that coming up and with really military hardware and just trying to, you know, take over the streets. And he just said, well, you know, nothing stops a bullet like a job. I thought it was such a good expression. Yeah, that's so true. You know, just give these guys some opportunity. So I know it's radical, but you know, how about we give these guys a chance, give them a job, give them some opportunity. And I think that ethos of just, you know, okay, he got in late with these guys, but if you could do it young, if you can give people hope, and wherever I go, you know, when I've been doing these stories, often you find it, you know, you're going to schools or pupil referral units where there's been problems and stuff like that. And the solution is always opportunity. It's always hope, isn't it?
We've got to address the root causes, yeah.
Yeah.
What about when you're out with the cops and you said you saw some crazy things? What did you see?
Oh, what, in Los Angeles?
Yeah. And what year was this?
Oh, what year was this? This would have been about 2007, 2008.
Okay.
Yeah. And I decided to do a thing on gangs, and I just had, in my area, I was living in Camden at the time, there'd been a big gang killing. This Somali kid had been stabbed in the neck, and I'd witnessed it. I'd seen it happen. And I thought, I really want to look into what's going on here. And I looked into Somali gangs in Camden. And then I said, well, I want to look into all the other gangs. So I had a little look at Manchester and what was going on there. And then Glasgow, where, again, different thing again. It's like the gangs in Glasgow, they're out of the gang by the time they're 15. You know, well, this was before they had a real crackdown and they managed to sort out a lot of the problems in Glasgow. But they used to have a massive preteen gang problem in Glasgow, which was like, you know, and it was extraordinary. It was all down to what state you lived on, what tag you put on your wall. And we really got to know, and I was really enjoying just getting to know different types of gangs, because I just became a little bit obsessed with it, because it's just so interesting. Actually, with Glasgow, the funny thing was when we went to see their tag, they put a brick through our window, through the car window, whilst they'd gone to show us the tag, and stole the video camera and the sat nav from the car. So when I get back to the car, I called them up and said, any chance we could have our stuff back? And he said, we can give you the sat nav for 50 quid, but we've already sold the video camera. I said, guys, I'm coming back to interview tomorrow. You've given me your phone numbers. You know, why would you do this? He said, why would you leave your car parked on our estate and not expect us to do that? So then I went to Los Angeles, and yeah, we you know, there was just it was mostly there were shootings. So there was one shooting we went to, but the police were literally terrified to go into these areas, and you almost like wouldn't get out of the car. So there'd be a reported shoot. I mean, they would get out of the car and they'd maybe go and speak to someone, and sometimes it would just be someone tried to shoot someone. So that I didn't see anyone get shot, but there was times when they would just go, this gang member is in the wrong district, and they'd pull them over, and they'd just almost like take their shirts off and see what tattoos they had to, you know, show what affiliation they had. Say, well, what are you doing here? You're not supposed to be here. You're supposed to be in this area. And they might just sort of like pull them over, cuff them up, and take them down to the station just to find out what they're doing in that area. And it, you know, there was no police operation in there where they wouldn't be wearing kind of full body armor to go and see, you know, what was going on. And then we looked at the prisons and some of the kind of prison riots that had happened based around gang affiliation, and we got sort of CCTV footage from Pelican Bay and places like that, where there was like proper full on kind of, and it seemed like the whole thing, I mean, you probably know better than me, but it seemed like what we learned was that the whole thing was basically being run from the prisons.
Yeah, the drug gangs have come out. It started in prison, these gangs, and now they're just massive drugs and murder for hire businesses across the whole country.
Mm.
And again, that is because the profit of the black market in drugs has been the biggest thing that criminals can make money off in the history of the world, created by drug laws.
Yeah.
Escobar could source coca paste for like $60 a kilo when he was starting, and it was going for $60,000 a kilo in America in the 70s. And so it doesn't matter who you arrest. Escobar, Chapo.
That price has come down now, hasn't
Oh
it?
yeah,
Massively.
I used to be able to get it for about 12 from Mexico.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was back in the 90s, late 90s.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah, because I was thinking in the 90s it was around about in London it'd probably be about what 45.
That was massive, wasn't it? Here the price,
and then
London.
It sort of slowly came down, and we looked at that. It was certainly for the National Crime Agency believed that it was quite a lot to do with the Albanian from the European market. The Albanians making direct routes into Colombia, so not going through the kind of the kind of wholesalers in Antwerp and places like that, but actually kind of making up their own links, and then just basically cutting out the middleman and cutting out a lot of the basically undercutting the market, so that they could kind of control the cocaine market in the UK.
It's all about the distribution network, isn't it? The wholesale importation system.
Yeah.
What do you know about that? The wholesale importation.
I looked into that a little bit, but it did look to me like, well, I mostly spoke to the National Crime Agency about this, and Tony Saggers, who used to be in command of looking at that particular side of things, and his take on it was that the reason it had changed was because the Albanians had come in and managed to every year sort of cut a little bit more and a little bit more off the price, the wholesale price, by forging their own relationships with the cartels in Colombia, and then just passing that on to the end user. But I don't think the Albanians have a huge street network. I mean, if to start with, there's not that many of them. You know, there's quite a small number of Albanians in the UK compared to, I'm not sure what it is post-Brexit actually, but compared to, say, the Polish community. Although, funnily enough, the Albanian community have the second biggest prison population in the UK after of foreign nationals.
Is it the second biggest?
Yeah.
After what's the first
after
then?
Polish.
After Polish.
But there's about 1 million Polish people in the UK as opposed to, or there was, when I last looked at it, as opposed to like much fewer than that Albanians.
So it's disproportionate then.
Very disproportionate. But you think about it, there's many, let's just get this straight, many legal legally working Albanians working in all sorts of fields in the UK. But they did come in, there was quite a big influx after the Kosovo war, where there was people from Albania who claimed to be Kosovo Albanians who came in as refugees, and there was quite a big people trafficking, prostitution network set up by them, and also cannabis. There's a lot of cannabis grown there, and I think they just simply thought, if we're already importing cannabis in, and we're already got other things being brought into the UK, then we may as well get involved in the cocaine market, because that's really lucrative.
So what's the shipping route from Colombia then?
Well, it's normally quite a lot of it. There's so many different ones, but I mean the classic is perishable goods. So put your cocaine in a shipment of bananas or coconuts or not coconuts, pineapples. Pineapples is a good one, because they just hollow them out and put them in the pineapples. And you either have a legit business that you run alongside your cocaine business, or you have what's called rip in, rip out, where you have corrupt officials in the ports in Antwerp who will then pull out your dodgy batch of pineapples. And then there'll be either what's called coopering, where the boat will come near to the UK and then another smaller vessel will come out from the UK to meet. And there's been quite a lot of recent drug seizures of coopering of yachts where, several large consignments of cocaine have been, I think one quite recently worth about 50 million off the coast of Cornwall, and another one in Aberdeen, where, they've just basically a smaller ship has met a bigger ship and taken the consignment in. And there's still some who will try the direct route. There was quite a recent case of a group who were mixed nationality who hired a plane. Did you hear about this one?
Mm-mm.
Hired a private jet and pretended they were officials for a rock band of some description. Landed in Colombia, had managed to have a corrupt set of baggage handlers and security officials meet them and go through a whole kind of fake security sort of show for everybody else to make it look like they were being checked. Then hired these armored vehicles or whatever to go and collect all the drugs. Brought them back, went through the same process again with their theatre of the pretend checking you're seeing all your bags. And obviously by this stage the suitcases are full of drugs, and then flew straight back into private airport in the UK. And they'd done this, and they'd done it at least once before they got caught. And whether they'd done it as a dry run, they don't know, but they know they did it once before. And yeah, they basically pretended they were the management for some touring rock band.
If you want more on the coke routes, then we recently interviewed Andrew Pritchard. I think it's called 100 Million Coke Deal Kingpin. And he had a whole team of UK border agents in his pockets.
Oh, really?
Yeah, came out at his trial.
There was some baggage handlers at Heathrow who were caught. I mean, that's one of the things they're talking about. There's lots of corruption in Antwerp, obviously, and there has to be for this whole thing to work. But in the big kind of the Dutch ports, and one of the things that Tony Saggers talks about is with Brexit, that corruption has to move to the UK shores. So you're going to have more corrupt officials because quite possibly some of these routes will now have to be more direct for your bananas and your, to avoid, all the customs checks and all the rest of it going through Europe. So, does Brexit mean that we'll have more corruption and more violence? And I don't know. That's a theory from.
Have you read Saviano's books?
No, I haven't, no.
He describes how the coke always keeps flowing and the money always keeps flowing. Everything it comes into contact with, it corrupts. There's always somebody in the profession that will be corrupted by that money to keep it all flowing. Yeah.
It does seem to be the case, doesn't it?
It is, yes.
I mean, it's, the key thing is if there's a market, isn't it?
Well, I mean, it was Milton Friedman who warned George H.W. Bush what would happen, The Economist. If you've made worthless plants more valuable than gold, it's an iron law of economics. It's always going to flow, no matter who is arrested. The profit percent is too great. I think more recently Richard Branson and The Economist have all spoken out about this, but the government continues to maintain the status quo. So,
well, we were saying there was one case of this Albanian kingpin who got caught in the UK, and I think the court case was a couple of years ago now. And he was using lorry drivers to get the drugs in, and they were being paid, 20 grand a time. Now, if your salary is £30,000 a year, and you're being paid 20 grand for one trip, it's tempting, isn't it?
It's tempting, and there's a never-ending supply of people who are going to do it to keep everything flowing. Yeah. All right then. So you mentioned the scoreboard.
Yeah. So the scoreboard is well, when I was talking about that case in Ipswich, that's what the gang would sing about. They'd sing about scoring like number 23. Michael Jordan's number 23, keeps scoring goals in basketball. And when I first heard about the case, I was thinking, why are they talking about scoring goals? And what are they talking about? What's that got to do with selling drugs? Anyway, then I read up about this case in South London, a guy called Raheem Butt. Have you heard of him? He was shot he was from a gang called Moscow 17. And I think their rivals are something like Zone 2, something like that. And they're Moscow 17, quite renowned, nasty gang. Well, whether he was a member or not, and that would be disputed, he was certainly in their drill videos. Now, some people will always say, well, that doesn't mean he was selling drugs or anything like that. But what he did do was he sung about the scoreboard. And he said, how are you going to score points against us? And they would sort of list off the number of people who from the rival gang who they've either slashed or shot or, and so it emerged that there was this scoreboard amongst London gangs. And some of the youth workers told me that it was as blunt as, 5 points for a stab in the leg, 10 points for a stab in the chest, 50 points for a stab in the neck. And it was a literal scoreboard. And this is the gamifying of gang violence, isn't it? This is Call of Duty. You've been playing this game in your bedside late at night, and now you can play it on the streets with your gang. And that's the scoreboard. And I found there were, parents I spoke to who said that if their kids had been murdered, that the brother had been told, oh yeah, we got some points for, whatever rival gang. And that seemed to be a thing. And so part of the possible motivation for the murder of Tavis Spencer in Ipswich was, these guys had sung about scoring on the scoreboard, and they thought, well, let's go. I mean, obviously they've been humiliated in a soap shop, but is it also part of this kind of let's go and score some points? So and that it's certainly in South London there's been some kind of serious a bit like actually used to be in the day in Glasgow, where they would literally just meet up for a fight, and it would be this kind of almost Clockwork Orange style dystopian violence. And police would describe turning up at the scene and they thought there'd been like some kind of terrorist attack or something, because there's just people lying all over the floor with, bloodied wounds and people chalking up their scores. So that's just a thing that I think we ought to be aware of as a society, that this subculture exists. And maybe it's a small thing that not everybody's doing, but the fact that we can have young kids turning violence into a game like that just says something about where we're up to now.
And they've always said there's no correlation between video games and violence. How silly we are to think that.
Yeah.
All right, so we've interviewed a lot of people who've got out of prison like older. They went in young and came out much older.
Yeah.
And they talk about the younger generation coming in this day and age. Back, the armed robbers, beginning of the drugs, there was like a bit of a moral code, but it's completely disintegrated. Yeah. And they say these youngsters come in now just completely cold. They've killed people. They didn't have a care in the world out on the streets. They've thrown their lives away. They got life sentences. And trying to fathom how to help these kids turn their lives around. So to do that, you got to understand the psychology of them, of the modern gang member.
Yeah.
And you wrote a whole chapter on that.
Yeah.
So what is the psychology of the modern gang member?
Well, very different to your old school, what you were just talking about. Can I tell you my best ever crime story?
Please do.
Which has got nothing to do with anything that we're talking about.
Go for it.
Old school. Before I was a journalist, I went to this arts installation in Serpentine in Hyde Park. And there's this young artist there, and I got talking to him, and then his dad got talking to me, and I must have spoken to him about 5 minutes about, he was talking about the search for El Dorado and how criminals would had this mentality of almost like adventurers, and that they were that criminals were sort of the modern day sort of pirates of the world. That all they really wanted was that one big hit, that last big job. That was all it was all about. I had no idea who this guy was until I sort of said, who are you? And he said, I'm Bruce Raymond. Bruce Reynolds. I said, I've never heard of it. I'm Bruce Reynolds. I masterminded the great train robbery. Oh, yeah, that Bruce Reynolds. Okay. And I had this amazing conversation with the man who masterminded the great train robbery. And he, like you, when he was in prison, read a lot. And he talks a lot about, was it worth it? In a way, for him, he said, I deeply regret the time I spent in prison, because it was, for him, it was, I think, 10 years of his life. He got sentenced to 25. I think he ended up spending 10. And then he'd also had a whole period of his life on the run, right? So, and he deeply regretted that somebody died in the what had happened in the great train robbery. But he couldn't quite get over the fact that he kind of loved that world, and that through his crime, he had become something. But it just struck me that he talked about this search for El Dorado, because I think even now, the kids of today have that image of crime. We all read crime books, we watch crime on TV. We have a glamorized image of it, that it'll lead you out of a better life. But if you actually look at the psychology of gang members, the one thing that they most have in common is mental health problems. And actually, they have both got into gangs because they have mental health problems, and being in gangs aggravates those mental health problems. And there was a fascinating psychologist I met who used to work on children who'd been through trauma of war. It's like Rwanda. She'd worked in Rwanda. She'd worked with kids who'd been caught up in their families being killed in earthquakes, that sort of thing, like really deep-seated trauma. And she came back and she worked with some gangs in London. She said, I've never seen anything quite as bad as these kids. I mean, they are just as bad as the kids I'm dealing with in these war zones, in these terrible places. They are deeply psychologically damaged. And it might be that they've been damaged to start with by domestic violence at home, abandonment, seeing stuff on the streets that, you may have seen, but I haven't seen my best friend get stabbed to death on the street. These kind of things. I have seen kids. I have actually seen a guy nearly bleed to death on the streets, and it's pretty darn traumatic. And, but if it's your best friend, or if it's, and so they become hyper vigilant, and they, she said, I'd interview these kids and they'd always have to sit facing out, the room. They couldn't have their back to the door. If you walk down the street, they're looking around, they're looking in the wing mirrors of the cars to see who's following them. They're constantly on it. And if you're living like that, it does your head in, it messes you up. And these kids, one of the so she essentially said, look, you can kind of figure out who's likely to fall into gang membership, who's going to fall into county lines and that sort of thing pretty early on if they've got certain factors. And she sort of went through it. Actually, drug taking wasn't a huge one. It was more, family, parents together, the things you'd expect, the environment they live in. Have they witnessed X, Y, and Z? And if they had sort of 7 of the 15 factors, you could work out, by the age of 8, you could work out if this person was in a high risk category. And essentially what she's saying is, if you can work that out that early on, then direct your funds, your public money towards those kids. It's like a pension. Put the money in early, get to those kids young, and literally everywhere along the line I went, whether it was uncle, I'd say, uncle, how do you stop this? He said, get to the kids young before I get to them. You got to get in there really early, because that's where the problems start. And if you can, and there are projects where I've done projects in America where, you've isolated the kids who you think have got potential problems of post-traumatic stuff that's happened early in their lives, or they have difficult upbringings. And they've worked out, some of those projects where they've worked out that actually the money they invest in those projects comes back, either in the fact that they haven't then had to put this person into prison for the rest of their lives and pay for them that way, or that person has actually become, a useful member of society and pays tax and all the rest of it. So, yeah, I think the psychology of it, understanding that I think I heard someone in a podcast saying the number of people in prison, there's like 80% of prisoners or something have mental health problems. It's the same with the young kids in gangs. They've often gone into those gangs because they've got some mental instability, and I think the psychological aspect is something we should be aware of, because what is going on in the young kid's head that he's willing to plunge a knife into another young kid? There's got to be something wrong.
And what are we seeing? The government shutting down youth centres and making it worse. We need to give the kids something to do. So you did just...
You know what? It's not just give them something to do. Youth centres come with youth workers. And what you need is guys on the ground. And actually, the former children's commissioner, his name I just forgotten, I can't clean it out of my head, said that you need to, we had this program to get lots of teachers teach first. Well, we basically just said we're short of teachers. We need to train up teachers very quickly. We need to kind of, it's almost like a national crisis. We need to get this going. So we're going to have grants. We're going to encourage people to do it. They need to do that with youth workers. They need to get, a national program that says, right, we need guys on the streets who kids can go to, who they can look up to. And yes, install them in youth projects. There was research by a select committee a couple of years ago that looked at the correlation of knife crime and the shutting down of youth centres. And the areas that had shut down the most youth centres had the highest rises in knife crime. It's as simple, that sometimes these things aren't necessarily connected, but there did look to be a correlation.
So all this money being pissed away on the war on drugs that's achieved nothing could be going to open youth centres, more youth centres, and do exactly what you just proposed. Have people mentoring, the kids and giving them far more options in life than just running around the streets where they get recruited.
Well, you talk in the book about lethal absence of hope.
Yes, I like that expression.
That's your problem.
Yeah. You just dropped in the conversation there that you were present when someone was almost bled to death on the streets. Yeah. How did you manage to get in that circumstance?
That was when I was doing the stuff on gangs in Glasgow, and we went out with a stab unit. Back in the day before, and that's what Glasgow did. They really did just go, right, we're going to put youth projects, youth workers in all the centres and areas where there's a problem. But before they did that, in fact, they were just starting to do it when I went out and did the stuff when I got my car smashed into. I think the night before or the night after that, I went out with the police, and we went and we were just going around, and it was weirdly, they said it's a really quiet night. When someone says that, something's going to happen. And then we got called to this stab scene, and there was a guy there just on the ground, and he'd been stabbed in the neck. And all the young kids around, and they're taking their tops off and shoving it into his neck. Similar scene to the one I saw in Camden, actually, with the Somali guy. And they're just trying to shove bung the hole up, which is all you can do. And if someone's stabbed in that, and if someone's bleeding, I've done my hostile environment course. Pressure is everything. You've got to get the pressure on, especially if it's arterial. You've got to get the pressure on the artery to stop the blood coming out, and that's what these guys were doing. And a couple of years later, I called up the guy, the guy's family, and I interviewed him, He survived, but he was brain damaged, you know, it was a stabbing over a girl, I think.
Over a girl, was it?
Yeah, I think it was over a girl. But it was all about, you know, the rival the little gangs it's I've very rarely seen a stabbing that isn't over something trivial.
So we've talked about the economics of this then. My thing is, with writing about Escobar, I learned that worthless plants become tens of thousands when you're selling them in the kilos on the streets of America. And you've talked about middle-class drug users being part of the demand side.
Yeah.
What's your perspective on that?
My perspective isn't just middle-class drug users anymore. But it was, but it isn't now. I mentioned that in the book because there'd been a lot of stuff where I think Sajid Javid, the Home Secretary, had said, you know, middle-class users are directly responsible for, you know, knife crime on the streets. And I think Grey Hands had said something similar. I think the police commissioner of the time had perhaps said something similar. I can't remember, but it was an ongoing theme, you know, that we needed to point the finger at the middle class. And I think there's fair enough on one point, and the point is, and it was a point made by a police officer to me. When we talk about the middle class, we talk about the people who have a conscience about what coffee they drink or whether they're going to use a certain type of coffee cup, but yet they don't think about the fact that, you know, one certain amount from every penny they pay on their cocaine wrap is going to go to trafficking women or you know, or exploiting children or all the other things that are wrapped up in the drug trade. So I don't think about that. And the other you know, accusation on the middle class is, I suppose, the university students who go and campaign for all sorts of different things to do with the rights of the individual, but, you know, are still doing their drugs, and maybe they don't think about the impact that is having on the things I've just mentioned. So it's the hypocrisy that I think was the politicians are trying to point to. But to say, oh, it's the middle class cocaine users who are causing the problem. I mean, I think there was an advert from Colombia which had I remember speaking to the Colombian government about it because we were talking about going over there, and they were going to make an advert. I don't know if they ever made it, of a banker snorting some cocaine up his nose, and then he lifts up the banknote and it fires a bullet and hits some guy in Colombia as a kind of, yes, show people what's going on here. But of course, as you'll note, with county lines, most of the cocaine is turned into crack cocaine, and their biggest part of their industry is actually their regular lower class junkies so that's the big part of their industry. And secondly, that even kind of pure cocaine is now, as far as we can see, an everyman drug. And if you talk to the various drug rehabilitation charities and so on and so forth, they will tell you that most of their clients come from all walks of life, and it's not a middle class problem. So it's perhaps wrong to kind of emphasize that the middle classes are responsible for all that's going on with their cocaine use, but it's also probably fair to say that they are slightly hypocritical if they're kind of, you know, going fair trade on their bananas.
Because in the very beginning, it was like Coke was for rock stars and millionaires, and
yeah,
if you go back to like the 70s,
a lot of people tell me, you
before
know,
the explosion of it.
When I was interviewing people at Cocaine Anonymous, they were talking about, you know, oh, Patsy Kensit, you know, she'd walk out with a bit of Coke under her nose and she's going off to snog Liam Gallagher, and, you know, that was really cool, you know, and that, you know, cocaine had that really cool image, and those addicts who I met, a lot of them talked about that's what got them into it. It was just that idea of it being really kind of quite, you know, quite a cool thing. But I don't know if you've ever been to one of these groups, unbelievable. I mean, obviously it's anonymous, so I'm not going to say who's in there, but the stories are astonishing. You would have a a person who would be talking about buying night goggles because they were paranoid about who was in the bedroom and looking through keyholes. Like someone said they spent like just the whole night looking through the keyhole to trying to work out who was coming. And another one sort of said they had to time their sleeps by the washing machine. It's just really strange behavior. They would all just, because they're in a group of people who all understand each other, all this stuff comes out. But then someone will say, yeah, last week I was stood on the edge of a bridge and I was going to kill myself. But that person, what I love about Cocaine Anonymous is that person probably wouldn't tell anybody else, but he's just told a whole room of people. And the reason he's told them is because they've just admitted to all the embarrassing rubbish that they've done over the years of their life. And it's just unbelievable. I honestly, I would, even though I don't have to worry about it, I would happily, for an afternoon's entertainment, go to a Cocaine Anonymous meeting, because they're all fabulous people, all trying to deal with a problem that they have. And the brutal honesty in the room is fantastic.
So again, another pointer there is that the proliferation of drugs into all sections of society over time is a function of the economics of the business. And I interviewed a psychiatrist, I think, out of Canada recently, and he said because of the deaths of fentanyl and the proliferation of that, he just wished they could go back to the good old days of heroin. How sad is that?
That's
yeah.
Why? Because what? It's less addictive, or?
Well, every year the drug market expands.
Yeah.
The cost goes down and the product gets stronger.
Yeah.
And it reaches more sections of society. So as it gets stronger, what we're seeing with the fentanyl and stuff, look at all of the deaths that are being caused around that product now. So how bad is it?
That's what responsible for one of the big mass lots of deaths in Scotland that I was talking about. Their death rate had a big spike last year, and I think part of it was because of a batch of fentanyl in one area. I think if you look back at the papers, there was a lot of people died because of it.
So in the competitive black market run by criminals, the stronger the product, the more you maximize your profits. So it's just it should just keep getting stronger now, as it has done for decades, until it gets so bad, we've got to do something about it. They stopped alcohol prohibition after 10 years, but they've just let this keep going.
Yeah, interesting way of looking at it. I hadn't looked at the prohibition thing, definitely. My daughter's been studying prohibition in America, and she's saying exactly the same thing. Yeah, totally.
Criminality.
Yeah, totally.
So you did try to get through to some politicians about this, including the Home Secretary. She read extracts from your book.
So the book was serialized in the Mail, in the Daily Mail.
Congrats.
There it was. And about 2 days into serialization, Priti Patel's special advisor gave me a call and said, will you come in and see her? She's been reading it. And I gave her the book. And she read it in about 2 days. And she invited me to go on a raid with her. I'd been on plenty of police raids before. But yeah, no, I had a conversation with her because she said, look, come in, I want to talk about it. Because she'd not long been Home Secretary then. She said, look, this is an albatross around my neck. The whole issue of county lines. I've inherited this problem. I want to deal with it. So I thought, well, fair enough. If I'll happily talk to you about it. And we didn't talk about whether or not drugs should be legalized. But what we did talk about was what I've been telling you about the psychology of the kids, getting to them young, setting up the youth projects, getting the investment in, nothing stops a bullet like a job. Opportunity, get rid of the lethal absence of hope. And and she said, what about policing? I think we have to give them credit that, they have over lockdown managed to take out a large section of the number of lines, the known lines. I think what we know is that the market's still there and that they will be replaced. And certainly, for example, the 6 kids who got locked up in Suffolk, as soon as those guys weren't selling drugs anymore, there were two guys from Bury St Edmunds who turned up. One of them ended up stabbing a drug dealer, and a young kid goes to prison for murder. So that kind of carousel of young people who are willing to get involved in this is ever present, and everybody knows it. So I think that the Home Secretary seems to have a good handle on the policing aspect of it and trying to do that. I'm not convinced yet we've seen the evidence that they're going to kind of deal with seriously the social side of things, and Anne Longfield, Children's Commissioner, was suggesting to me was not just that we get a kind of army of social workers, but that we put the top sort of 50 areas that are in serious trouble into special measures. And over the summer holidays, which is when a lot of these kids go missing, we keep the schools open. We find out ways of, we force the schools to stay open and provide activities for these kids who aren't getting the activity they need. I mean, we're talking a much bigger scale project than even what Marcus Rashford is suggesting around free school meals, but actually, free school activities and stuff like that to keep these kids occupied and to steer them away and to give them some good role models from, because if a guy who's selling drugs and pushing people out to the suburbs to do his dirty work for him has the audacity to call himself uncle and sees himself as the uncle of these kids, then that's a pretty sad indictment on society. So, yeah, I think hopefully they can do more than on that side of things, and that's what we talked about. But she's focused on the policing.
Well, what's her name? Patel? Priti Patel and her colleagues. You are addressing the symptoms, not the cause. Can't you see? Decades of policing has not affected anything. More drugs, stronger, more deaths, more violence, knife crime across London, hundreds of thousands dead in Mexico. What is it going to take to get through to you to address the root cause? And the principal cause is drug laws have made worthless plants more valuable than gold. And it is the biggest profit incentive in the history of the world for organized crime to flood the entire world with drugs. Until you guys take over that market and take it out of the hands of the criminals, this is going to keep getting worse. But you just pass it off to the next administration and say, oh, I inherited this problem. What can I do about it? Sorry.
That's all right. It's your show.
So you're saying that some of the county lines were taken down during the pandemic?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it was obviously a difficult time for them. A kid traveling on a train is going to stand out, right? I mean, I heard stories of them dressing kids up as key workers.
Yeah.
And that
London,
sort of thing.
yeah.
But what you're going to see now is, I think what people are worried about is that, there's a lot of people have their businesses impacted. And so if you're a taxi driver and, and in a small town in the UK, and someone says, can you courier some kids around me because you're not getting much business doing anything else right now, then you might be more tempted to do it. So there's, I think the economics of the lockdown and the pandemic is possibly going to feed into fueling the industry. And I think there will be worries and concerns around that. And as far as I can see, it's, everything's just back to business as normal post-lockdown.
So what's this Daniel Morgan situation?
Daniel Morgan. Okay. So this is completely nothing to do with county lines.
Okay, go
but
for
your producer said, do you want to talk about it? Because I've been involved in the Daniel Morgan case. Daniel Morgan, very quickly summarize, is killed in a car park with an axe in the head in 1987. He was a private investigator. He ran a small private investigations firm. His business partner, Jonathan Rees, was drinking in the pub with him when he left. He was basically the family believed that he was on the verge of exposing a massive police corruption scandal. And since 1987 till now, there's been, I think, 5 investigations into his murder. There's never been a criminal conviction, but it has been a thorn in the side of every Metropolitan Police Commissioner since the murder of Daniel Morgan, over allegations that basically the whole investigation was corrupt. And so last week was it last week or week before, at the inquiry, which has been taken 8 years into his murder to find out whether indeed there was corruption. And at the end of that inquiry, the independent team said that it wasn't just corruption at that time, but that actually the Metropolitan Police is inherently corrupt. And they pointed the finger at the current commissioner, Cressida Dick, because when she was assistant commissioner, they felt that she obstructed the inquiry by not helping them enough to get hold of files and documents. So the reason this all goes back to why was this particular murder considered corrupt is because one of the investigating officers who was charged with the case eventually became a suspect. It's a very complicated case, but essentially there were allegations made against him and Sid Fillery and Jonathan Rees, who was the business partner, that they had somehow been involved in it. Now, it has to be said that when they were eventually charged and it went to court, the court case collapsed, and that they actually got damages against the Metropolitan Police for malicious charges. So what essentially this inquiry was looking at is, was there corruption involved? And they said, yeah, the whole thing was, full of corruption from start to finish. So, for example, you had a man who was, it all plays into the relationship between private investigators, the media, and the police. So if you have a police officer who's investigating the case, who is friends with one of the suspects and actually interviews that suspect and doesn't declare that he is the friend of that suspect, and later becomes the business partner who replaces the guy who's been murdered, then it...
There's a conflict of interest.
There's a little bit of a conflict of interest going on. And this report found that even after Jonathan Rees was declared a suspect, he would be down the pub with the cops, drinking with them, because they were mates. And then when you throw into the mix that Daniel Morgan was potentially about to expose a scandal within the police, there was a great deal of suspicion around, hang on a second, why were the forensics so bad on this case? Why didn't they manage to find a single thread? They didn't find any DNA. They didn't find any, nothing to link the killer. They took only 4 or 5 photographs at the scene. They didn't cordon off the area. All this came out in the inquiry. The whole investigation into this private investigator was very substandard. And it could be that it was just a terrible investigation. But when you've got one of the suspects almost like just hand in glove with the investigation, I mean, he even went. There's a great documentary on Channel 4 called Murder in the Car Park. It's brilliant. It's got all the key players. It's got all the suspects being interviewed. It's got the family, and it just plays through the whole thing, and it shows how Jonathan Rees was too closely involved in the investigation for someone who was then a suspect and the last guy to see last man, he was drinking in the pub with this guy when he went out to the back of the car park and got axed in the head. But it was almost as bad was the fact that they then said, this inquiry team said, that it wasn't just the initial investigation, but actually when there was an investigation into the investigation by Hampshire Police, so a separate police force, that too was not independent. So having tried to deal with the fact that there might have been corruption, they're essentially saying that the corruption spread. And then they said, even when we did our years later, when we're trying to get access to what they call the Holmes directory, which is the kind of police directory that has all the files on this case, they were being blocked. And they were saying, look, actually, the assistant commissioner at the time was Cressida Dick, and she wasn't helping us, and we're here to try and be an independent, and we can't get hold of this stuff. Now, the Metropolitan Police say that they were helping, so I should say that Metropolitan Police say that obviously that they did try and assist with this inquiry. But the allegation from an independent panel that Metropolitan Police was institutionally corrupt, was really stuck with them. And I interviewed the assistant commissioner after this report came out, and he said, look, we're not, I don't think we are. So they are saying, look, we don't agree with this. We essentially don't agree with this. And I don't think there was a question mark over, well, would Cressida Dick keep her job? It does look as if the people, who decide whether she keeps her job or not, such as the Mayor of London and the Home Secretary, they have confidence in her. So I don't think she's going to go. But what might change is, I think there might be a kind of call for more transparency amongst police officers to declare their interests, especially around, there's often been concerns around sort of Masonic interests and stuff like that.
We've had a few cops on that have been Masonic. If
you're investigating someone, for example, who's in the same lodge as you, that's obviously, that should be declared. That's the sort of thing where, you need to know. I'm not saying that's relevant to this particular case, but that was one of the recommendations. Police officers, there need to be a register of interests of police officers so that we know if there's any conflicts when they're investigating a case, that sort of thing. And I think the other thing they were really concerned about was whistleblowers. So if someone actually came out and said, look, there's corruption here, they found this report very damningly said, look, actually what often happens is they're either told to move on, they get bullied or intimidated, or they get hounded out of the force. And, again, this is the finding of the independent review. It's not me saying this. This is what the review team says. They're not got a proper system in place for whistleblowers. And in a case like Daniel Morgan, which has still never been solved, that is, that's a real problem, because there are people probably who might know what's going on who don't feel they can come forward.
But it does tie back to drugs, because one of the biggest factors corrupting the police all over the world
there is a drugs connection.
Is the drugs, because if you're a couple of cops going and raiding a house, like you said about the truck driver who can get 20 grand in one pop, and you see 50,000 in a safe with a bunch of drugs, where's that 50,000 going to go if you're on 20, 30,000, 40,000 a year?
Well, look, I don't know the case well enough to talk about it in huge detail.
Yeah.
But it's worth looking into for that aspect of it, because there was a case that was basically, there was a police officer who was known to Daniel Morgan, the victim, who was investigating Brinks Matt, who about 3 months later committed suicide. And it's been alleged quite recently that Daniel Morgan and he were going to sell a story on police corruption to do with the importation of cocaine. So, but again, this is all speculation. We don't know what the motive is. The motive could have been that, this guy was a private investigator. He probably had lots of people who didn't like him. He was a bailiff. There were a lot, but whoever, it wasn't a robbery. His wallet was stolen, but he had a a wad of notes in his pocket that weren't taken. There were some notes that were taken, and it's thought possibly even some files removed from his car. So someone didn't go up in the back of a car park with an axe and just axe someone to death over the head and then nick their wallet. That's not what happened. They didn't do it. They didn't do it for that reason. I think we can safely assume that whoever killed Daniel Morgan wanted Daniel Morgan dead, not just some random bloke who wanted the wallet from. So I urge you to look into the case, because it really is a fascinating sort of corruption story.
All right, just one final subject then. Before we start on that though, how long were you a Sky News journalist for? When did you start that?
Started, went to Channel 5 News, which was part of Sky News, in 2005, and then crossed over to Sky News Pure 2010.
So what did you think then about the Jimmy Savile stuff being kept secret for so long at the BBC?
Well, it was a guy called Mark Williams Thomas who did the expose on Jimmy Savile.
We've had him in here.
Have you? And I met him once to do a story about paedophiles and got his advice, and seems like a very straight-headed guy. And I think that the problem with Savile was everyone was terrified of him because he used to threaten to sue people, and they were all the signs looked like they were there, didn't they? I mean, that Louis Theroux interview where he almost had him on the rails, I think it was a sign of the times, wasn't it? I mean, so many things that sort of went on over that time period where people just seemed to turn a blind eye are quite extraordinary. I still shiver when I look at that footage of Savile with the guy who was the leader of the pack, the other paedophile who was
Gary Glitter.
Gary Glitter. Have you seen that footage of them both on top of the pots together?
I've not. No, is it on YouTube?
Yeah. It just makes
Have you seen that one, James?
Shudder.
Savile and Gary Glitter together.
Oh, man. It just makes you shudder. But then you kind of, I don't know, do we all expressly in our heads will not want to believe that kind of thing goes on? It's there's part of human nature that, I mean, I met Jimmy Savile.
You met him?
I met him, yeah.
What was that like?
Well, he's like big into running, and I had a disabled brother, and I was pushing my brother around the Serpentine with my granny, and we were doing a sponsored run, and up comes Jimmy Savile, and I guess I would have been quite young. And seemed perfectly nice, and I think he was the best guy. And Jimmy Savile fixes it for everybody, and he seemed like this great guy. And I was just left with this great impression. And I'm sure that most people, if you weren't being abused by Jimmy Savile, had that impression of him. But it really took Mark Williams Thomas to basically forensically go through the cases and find a pattern of behaviour. And it just goes to show, because how many victims he had. And it took a documentary to find, it was only like 5 victims that he produced to start with, who the patterns of behavior was so similar that eventually, but even then, it was only after he died. And I just wonder if he was still alive, whether that would have yet come out, because it's, the rules and regulations about putting something like that on the telly and saying this guy is effectively, you've got to jump some real hurdles to do that.
Did you hear anything about Savile hosting weekly lunches for cops, and they come into his house and some of them going in rooms with girls?
No.
Anything about that?
No.
Do you think that Savile, it could be repeated, or it was something that only could happen in that bygone era?
I think never say never. I'm actually looking at a case at the moment of a paedophile who was convicted in this country of disseminating images, and we're looking very carefully at an issue of paedophiles changing their name by depoll. And what he did was changed his name, and I have to say allegedly because this case hasn't come to court yet in Spain, travelled to Spain, became an au pair under a new name with a new passport that he basically paid 45 quid to change his name to do it, and then went to work for 2 top schools in Madrid, and allegedly took videos of kids at those schools, about 30 or 40 kids. And it was only because there's a kind of crack unit in Australia that tracks the movements of various people and tracks the accounts of these people, said, we've seen this activity of this stuff that looks like it's coming from your school, and they managed to connect it somehow to his, I think when they arrested him, to his social media feed, that not he was obviously doing it on Tor, the black market internet site, but then he'd have stuff from his phone that he put publicly, and they've connected the two together. And they arrested this guy, and the only reason he was able to do it is because he can spend 15 minutes changing his name by depoll. So that's a big issue. And Sarah Champion, who's the MP for Rotherham, who has done a lot around the whole child abuse up in Rotherham, is currently one of several MPs who have been bringing this up with the new and trying to get legislation into the police crime sentencing and courts bill to say, look, we've got to look at this and either have a way of saying they can't change their names, or if they can change their names, and there might be legitimate reasons why they want to change their names. But, there's an argument that if they're trying to move on, it's one way of moving on. But if they are going to do that, then there must be a way of notifying the passport authorities and the DVLA and the police. They have an obligation, they have a legal obligation to do it within 48 hours. But if you're a devious sex offender, that's not necessarily going to be your number one priority. And it's not just, it's not just pedophiles, it's, domestic abuse perpetrators, rapists. We've seen, cases of this, and the Safeguarding Alliance, which is a very good charity that's looking into this, have got lots of evidence of a vast number of sex offenders doing this. So it's not quite a direct answer to your could this happen again, because you're probably more referring to, could this be something that could happen within an institution like the BBC? I hope that big institutions have safeguarding processes in place, but do not underestimate how devious some of these people are. That a guy would be that brazen just to change his name, travel to Spain, and just carry on doing it.
Do you have any final Savile questions, James?
How did we get onto Savile?
We've got a Savile documentary coming out.
Oh, have you?
It's going to be about 6 hours long.
Oh, really?
Yeah. But we're wrapping up now. Did you have anything? No? Okay. So, if you have watched, did you have anything to say in conclusion to the people watching this? Where can they find you?
Stay safe.
Where can they find you on social media?
You can find the book on Amazon.
All the links will be in the description box
fabulous,
of the video.
Fabulous book. Or you can get it on your Kindle.
No audiobook yet?
Yeah, there's an audiobook. You can get it on audiobook.
Good.
The guy who's reading it is a lot harder than I am. So sometimes when I'm quoted, I sound more like this. It's not my voice. I could have done it, couldn't I? I could have just put on the voice.
If people want to contact you on socials, you're on like Twitter.
Oh, yeah. Jason Farrell, Jason Farrell Sky.
Yeah.
There I am. You'll find me.
It's been an absolutely delightful afternoon speaking to you, Jason.
Lovely to talk to you too.
And, James has been raving about this book for ages. So for you to finally be here, this is like, you're his, what he's been talking about for so long.
Okay.
And if you've enjoyed it as much as I have, please go down and support Jason's work.
Watch Sky News. It's very good.
Watch Sky News. Check out his book. You can harass him on the socials. And,
Don't worry, I get enough of that.
So thank you for watching this today. Thank you to Joe and James for coming out to film it. And huge thank you to all the new subs. Subs logos down there. And most of all, huge thank you to Jason Farrell for coming out today and gracing us with his eloquency.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Good to meet you. Cheers.
Yes, brilliant.